got together, and they got together in
Berlin.
and so that's why they call it, but it was people from all over the world, pulmonologists from all over the world, came up with this criteria. You saw this one right here, you know, what we list for the PF ratios, what we're looking at. This spells it out more fully. You don't need to memorize this scale. Just knowing, this was the difference, that it had to be within 7 days. You have to have the whiteout, the bilateral opacities, and you have to have respiratory failure not fully explained by either cardiac failure or fluid overload. So you have to look at those things. Do an echo if you need it. So we kind of already talked about all of those things. But that's just kind of a recap for a good thing as well. Okay, hang on. Let me look at something. Okay. Do you want a break right now? Because this is a really good natural stopping point, or do you want me to keep going?
Keep going. We're okay.
Okay, we'll keep going. We'll look at the clock at 2 o'clock and see if we need a little break. We'll look at that and see as well. Okay, so we're going to talk about mechanical ventilation now and the different types of mechanical ventilations that are out there. This is just some of what's out there. I know that for my 2 Hogue employees, that, and you too, they were doing the heliox therapy on that one guy, the vaping guy. And so there's things out there that are not even listed on this board here, on this PowerPoint slide here. And there's a bunch of different strategies that we can use. But what happens in ARDS, the whole goal of getting someone with ARDS to survive is to recruit as much alveolar space as we can to do the biggest amount of O2-CO2 exchange. So that's the goal. But everybody's kind of different in how you can achieve that. So one is super PEEP. And super PEEP, when you get above 20 of PEEP, you really risk trauma, and then you also can pop blebs inside the lungs and create pleural effusions as well as sub-Q emphysema. Plus, you have to be able to have a blood pressure to tolerate PEEP. And so super PEEP is not usually used that much. But the great thing about super PEEP is that it does work well on an ARDS patient because it shoves more air into those alveolar spaces that are already taken up with all that junk that they have in them. So it does get the most, but it's not easily used, okay? Permissive hypercapnia. This is a strategy that works best on somebody who has a CO2 problem, which would mostly be your emphysema patients, and your CO2 retainers could be asthmatics, but not always. So what we do is we let them run a higher than normal CO2, maybe 50 or so. And so the idea behind that is that it's a brain trigger so that the brain will grab for more O2. So they can combine permissive hypercapnia with super PEEP or inverse ratio or in prone position. So it can be added as well. Inverse ratio. So when we breathe in, it's a short period of time, and then we breathe out and it's a longer period of time. And you reverse that, so you have a long inspiratory cycle and a short expiratory cycle. No one can be awake for this. It is horrible. So just think about that. If you're breathing in, long time, you just stair step. You just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger in your chest, and so it's a horrible, horrible thing to do to someone. But the idea is that if you increase the inspiratory cycle, that again you can recruit more alveolar space and have a better O2-CO2 exchange as well. Prone positioning, which we're going to see a couple of slides on. The people who have done the research for prone positioning tell us that we recruit at least 30, if not more, percent alveolar space by laying someone on their stomach and letting them hang, that it does recruit a lot more alveolar space, but we'll talk about prone therapy in just a minute. High frequency ventilation, we used to affectionately call this guppy breathing, where you put somebody, you give them a rate of like 40. So they're just panting. And the idea behind that, again, is that if you are breathing so fast that the exchange is happening so fast that you are hopefully being able to grab more oxygen if it comes along as well. Let's see. The high peak protocols are listed in your book if you're interested on page 459. And and it shows a lot more about the high peak, but we really don't see the high peak use too often. Most patients just can't tolerate it as well. Okay. So there is something called the Ards net protocol. So it's what the Ards people who got together who said, maybe this will be the best thing for your Ards patient. That being said, there's so many other factors, and we try everything to oxygenate people if we can. But what they're saying is that it should be a high frequency ventilation, so a fast rate, and then you have, you base the lung volume on their ideal body weight. So most of the time when you're seeing what their tidal volume, thank you, it's like 450, 550, 600 at the most. In the old days, everybody was like a liter. We were really blowing them out. Then we knew we found out that we're causing a problem. So the idea here is that instead of getting their weight, because they're 14 liters positive of fluid, they're 10 pounds heavier than when they came in because they look like the Pillsbury Doughboy, we don't use that weight, but we based it on an ideal body weight for their height. And so the idea is a lower volume, so it all capitates a lower volume for these patients as well. High levels of PEEP if they can tolerate it. So all of these things together, tolerance for lower O2 if they can take it, and then just really knocking them out. All of these strategies are miserable, and so these are patients that are not going to be candidates for a daily sedation vacation, because you cannot wake them up when you're doing this to them. It would be mean and cruel, and we don't do that. Okay. So mechanical ventilation, we know that they're at risk for many complications, especially a ventilator-associated pneumonias. And again, the goal of intubating someone is to extubate them. So we'll get to the ethics lecture later, but the idea behind intubation is that they can get better. We can't always know. We are hopefully not intubating people that are at the end of their life and there's no way they're going to get better, but sometimes we know that happens because of family wishes as well. But the goal of getting someone intubated is to get them extubated as well. So we're going to look at the two types, volume ventilation and pressure ventilation as well. So we're going to look at this. How long do I want on this? 6.
We're going to talk about ventilator pearls today. If you haven't done any work on the ventilator, look at our other lecture on ventilator explained clearly, and there's a link there for that. What today's lecture is going to be on is just some different vignettes about things that I use in general when I'm going to put someone on a ventilator, and I call this ventilator pearls. So the first thing I would talk about is just when you put someone on a ventilator in general. When you put someone on a ventilator, you have to know what's going to happen to their pressure, specifically their intrapleural pressure. So if you look at the lung here, they sit in a cavity called the thoracic cage, and there's a pressure associated with this space between the lungs and the chest wall. So if we could measure that, and we would see it on a transducer, we would notice something. That when someone is breathing spontaneously, what's going to happen is their diaphragm is going to contract, and instead of it being a nice dome, it's going to contract down, and it's going to cause the intrapleural pressure to go down. Okay? That's very important, because when the intrapleural pressure goes down, the lungs are going to get bigger, and therefore air is going to be sucked in. Key word there is sucked in, because there's a negative pressure, okay? That's how you breathe in a spontaneous fashion, okay? And then when you release, the air comes back up and back to zero again. So that's 0. In the situation where you have positive pressure ventilation, so you're putting someone on a ventilator, just the opposite happens. You're at a neutral level here. And then the ventilator goes ahead and pushes air, not sucks, but pushes air into your lung, and that's going to make a positive pressure in that pleural space. So you can see here that when you put someone from spontaneous breathing on a ventilator, they're going to go from negative pressure ventilation to positive pressure ventilation. By the way, the same thing happens if they're on BiPAP or CPAP. It's just that they're not intubated, but when they're intubated, it's even more so because you've inflated the cuff and you're basically pushing that air and you can measure the pressures. So this is positive pressure ventilation. So you just got to be aware of that because there's consequences to that. And here's one of the biggest consequences to that. Let's just draw this schematically here. Imagine we've got the heart here, and we know that the right atrium is where all the venous return comes back to. And here the pressure is fairly low. Let's say it's 0 to 5 millimeters of mercury, okay? And the reason why blood flows back here is because blood in the venous system is actually higher, okay? So it's actually higher than it is in the right atrium. And as a result, things go from a high pressure to a low pressure. You've got blood flowing back. So this is venous return going back this way, and that's the flow that it's going at. Well, here's the problem. When you put someone on positive pressure ventilation, this heart is also in that thoracic cage with the lungs. And so what happens is if you are putting someone from spontaneous breathing to on a ventilator, where you go from essentially negative pressure ventilation to positive pressure ventilation, the general average pressure in the heart is going to go up because the heart is sitting in that very space. And so as a result of that, your right atrial pressure also goes up. So let's say it goes up to here. Now if that's the case, that means the slope of this return is not going to be as steep as it was. And so your venous return is actually going to drop slightly. Okay? Now if that's the case, if your venous return drop, you know that the heart can only pump what it's given, right? So cardiac output is also going to drop, and that is going to drop blood pressure. Incidentally, the same thing happens when you're talking about positive end expiratory pressure, or PEEP. So PEEP is going to accentuate that. So where would this come in handy? This is a patient who is septic. Let's think about this. Let's think about a septic patient. This is a patient specifically whose venous return is going to be pretty low already. And they're septic, they've got a metabolic acidosis, they're looking kind of ill, you may need to intubate them. So what's the thing that you're going to do? You look at their blood pressure and it's maybe marginal. You've got to know that as soon as you intubate this patient, this is going to go up, their venous return is going to drop, and their blood pressure is going to drop. So in these patients, if I have time before I have to intubate them, if they don't look like they have to be intubated right away, the first thing I do is make sure I've got good IV access, or even put in a central line.